Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Ambassador's Lounge. We again have today with us Adam Weinstein, and our topic of discussion today is Afghanistan. We'll discuss various aspects, a bit on the historical perspective also. Adam, once again, welcome back to the Ambassador's Lounge.
Thanks for having me.
And ladies and gentlemen, I have with me Ambassador Riaz Bukhari and Ambassador Tanveer Khaskhali. Adam, initiating the conversation. Now, US spent $2.3 trillion, am I right, in Afghanistan? 2,324 US military personnel killed. 3,917 US contractors killed, 1,144 allied troops killed, 70,000 Afghan military and police personnel killed, 46,319 Afghan civilians, and above all for us, which is very important, 80,000 Pakistani lost their lives. What was American objectives in Afghanistan, and why could those objectives be not achieved through political process?
Well, I think when you ask what were the American objectives, I would say, well, in which year?
Did they keep on changing?
There's that quote, I forget who said it, that we fought a one-year war 20 times. It's something like that, I'm paraphrasing it, but that really is true. The immediate objective, of course, after the 9/11 attacks was to dismantle Al-Qaeda. And if you listen to one of George W. Bush's speeches from right after 9/11, he basically, first of all, he runs down the list of why the Taliban is horrible, but at the end he says that the Taliban need to turn over Al-Qaeda, they can't allow Afghanistan to be used for terrorism, and basically, in so many words, he almost outlines the terms that later became the Doha Agreement that was signed after 20 years of fighting. And it is a known fact that in the very early days after 9/11, it wasn't yet decided in the Bush administration that they would remove the Taliban from power. They wanted Mullah Omar to hand over Osama bin Laden. Yeah. He refused to do that. The ISI chief at the time met with Mullah Omar to try to convince him to meet the American demands. Of course, Mullah Omar refused, and the rest is history. And I think that first mistake was the Taliban's mistake. But the second mistake was Washington's mistake, which is that after we entered...
So first it was, you mean to say the policy was, it was basically a policy of vengeance.
Well, I wouldn't say vengeance. A transnational terrorist group had just conducted one of the largest. So
it was vengeance. It had conducted an operation, and you came back. It's just like what Israel is doing on Hamas.
Well, I wouldn't call. Well, we could get into that later. Keeping it narrowly focused to Al Qaeda, I can understand why the Bush administration wanted to get rid of Al Qaeda after it destroyed the Twin Towers and flew a plane into the Pentagon. I don't think that was, I wouldn't call that vengeance. I disagree with that. I think there was a military rationale behind dismantling Al-Qaeda. Now, we might call it vengeance in terms of how we executed the campaign in Afghanistan, fine. And I think there was a mood of vengeance in the air after 9/11. I was young at the time, but there was a mood of vengeance in the air. I think that would be natural for any country. But I wouldn't call it vengeance. I think there was a justification for dismantling Al-Qaeda. Since you brought up Hamas, we could say there's.
But you went into Afghanistan, right, with that particular mindset that you had to eliminate Al-Qaeda. Did you have that policy that how are you going to attain it? How are you going to achieve your objective? And then what after?
No, and that's where the mistakes were made. I mean, if we could go back in time, I think a more rational approach would have been, okay, we're going to view this as a narrow counterterrorism campaign focused on Al-Qaeda, and we recognize that the Taliban are a fact on the ground, and if there's Taliban who are willing to work with us, we don't have to completely eliminate the group. Where the campaign in Afghanistan went off the rails from the start was the fact that we tried to execute a counterterrorism campaign and a counterinsurgency campaign at the same time, and with less than reputable partners, perhaps. We were partnering with warlords. So in a sense, we were using terror to fight terror. I think that's where things went off the rails. There is no US leader, there's no world leader who could accept an attack at the scale of 9/11 without going to war with Al-Qaeda. The problem is that, in a sense, we went to war with Afghanistan itself. And that's the same mistake. I don't think we should go too much on a tangent about this, but that's the same mistake that the Israeli government is making in Gaza at this time. I can sympathize with why the Netanyahu administration wants to go to war with Hamas. The trouble is, both the way it looks in terms of optics and the reality for Palestinians is that they're essentially going to war with Palestinians in Gaza right now. And that's a mistake, and I think it's not going to end well for them.
Yes,
but the same thing happened. Well, I'm not going to say the same thing. It wasn't nearly at the scale of civilian casualties and things. So I'm not going to say it's the same thing. Let me retract that statement. But the same kind of short-sightedness existed in the early days of the war in Afghanistan, in which I think we should have executed a narrow counterterrorism campaign, but instead it became this expanded counterinsurgency, and we missed an opportunity, we missed a window in which there were Taliban who were willing to become part of the new political order, and they were willing to accept that the Taliban as an emirate had been defeated, but they would still participate in whatever the next political order of Afghanistan was. And we missed that window of opportunity, and instead we executed a war against the Taliban as well, who were not truly a threat to the United States the way Al-Qaeda was. Sure, they had harbored Al-Qaeda, but the Taliban as an entity, I don't think was a significant threat to the United States the way Al-Qaeda was. And while doing that and refusing to bring the Taliban into the new order, we gave them time to regroup, and the Haqqanis were crucial to that process, and the rest is history.
Adam, I'll be asking regarding the Doha Agreement. It could hardly be called a peace process. It was more of an arrangement to facilitate the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. How did the idea of a political process gain traction and acceptance within the US?
Well, it gained traction and acceptance within the Trump administration. Most of the United States, the general public was completely checked out of the war for years. Congress had long ago abandoned its duty of oversight. And so this was a war that was really being managed by the executive branch. Of course, that process had been started under the Obama administration in terms of the process of reaching out to the Taliban, having a political office in Doha, having dialogue. So I think it wasn't Trump's idea. But of course, Trump was the one who finally pulled the trigger and said, we're leaving. And I think Trump did that largely for domestic political reasons. But I think there was a calculation among those around him that the interests at stake in Afghanistan were not worth the investment. And I think that calculation was true.
Not worth the investment. You people had spent $2.3 trillion and yet say it was not worth the investment.
Well, that's the sunk cost fallacy at play.
Yes.
Adam, now the Taliban are in control in Kabul. We have seen them in the 1990s, and we are also, observing their style of governance these days. Their ideology is extremist. The group has a history of violence and extremism. no low tolerance on women's rights. My question is, what prompted the US to trust and sign an agreement with the group you always called terrorists?
Well, first, let me address the point you made right before, because you made a provocative point and then we switched. I have to address it. Look, we did invest an incredible amount in terms of financial investment and also lives lost. I agree with that wholeheartedly, but that's the sunk cost fallacy at play. The assessment was, is it worth the future investment? And the answer was a resounding no. And obviously it wasn't worth the previous investment either, but that ship had sailed. In terms of your question, sorry, say your question.
The question is, given Taliban's history.
Oh, why do we trust them for the Doha Agreement?
Yeah.
Because that agreement's not based on trust. That agreement was based, as you pointed out, or I think it was you who pointed it out, this was an agreement for the U.S. troops to withdraw. And the ironic thing about the Doha Agreement is that the number one priority of both sides, the Taliban and the United States, was for the U.S. to leave. That's why the process worked. Both sides wanted the same thing. The United States wanted to extricate itself, and the Taliban wanted the U.S. to leave, but they had to come up with some minimally acceptable conditions for that.
Okay.
That's why. It's not based on trust.
What were those conditions? What were the pledges made by the Taliban with the U.S. government? Are they honoring them?
Well, I'd say they're not honoring them. I mean, it's a political agreement. The United States was putting some stress on the agreement too after it was signed. In the time between when that agreement was signed to when the final withdrawal happened, the United States put some stress on that agreement as well. First of all, we were still conducting airstrikes against the Taliban, even though the Taliban weren't targeting U.S. troops. Now that was permitted, but that does place stress on an agreement. We can approach the agreement in one of two ways. We can approach it like attorneys who go clause by clause and say, has this been violated? Or we can approach it the way it was really understood, which is that it was a political agreement, and how much stress can this political agreement sustain? Well, it sustained the stress of U.S. airstrikes against the Taliban. It sustained the stress of the U.S. withdrawing after the deadline. It sustained the stress of the Taliban stonewalling their Afghan counterparts during negotiations and basically not negotiating in good faith. But the bottom line is what the agreement was really about was the U.S. extricating itself from the United States. The U.S. extricating itself from Afghanistan. And so as long as that condition was met, the rest were details in a sense. Now, I do think the folks who negotiated that agreement and who were part of Zal Khalilzad's team genuinely believed in the peace process. Okay. But the peace process, the intra-Afghan negotiations, that was always going to be a side effect of the agreement. The agreement could not hinge on that. Because if the agreement hinged on that, well, we'd still be in Afghanistan today. In fact, if there had been real progress in negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban, I'm not sure that the agreement would have, in the years preceding the agreement, I'm not sure that the agreement would have been necessary. But there wasn't. The agreement was an acknowledgement that we were in a deadlock in Afghanistan in which the Taliban had the military advantage. They were slowly gaining district after district. The Afghan government was slowly losing territory. The Afghan government itself was an unreliable partner in some ways. And the United States was not willing to put forth the kind of military investment that would have been required to turn the tide back. And even if it had done so, as it had during the surge, it's unclear that those gains would have been sustainable without permanently remaining in Afghanistan with very high numbers of U.S. troops. And no U.S. president was willing to do that. So given those conditions, what made sense was to leave.
Adam, now U.S. is out. Afghanistan is still suffering. Afghans are rather still suffering. Taliban may have brought some stability, but of course, economically, the situation is not good there. Anyway, Tell me, now you're out, you've extricated yourself successfully. What is, or how does Afghanistan figure in your future strategy?
I think Afghanistan is a footnote at the bottom of the page in terms of U.S. priorities in the world right now, if I'm being quite honest. It really doesn't figure. I think I think there's, of course, Tom West is doing great work. Who's this, the special envoy to the Taliban? I mean, to Afghanistan, not to the Taliban. I have to correct that. But in the reason I had that slip, I think, is because that's who the U.S. has to deal with. But of course, he does interact with Afghan stakeholders in the diaspora and other stakeholders in Afghanistan, and so it's not, you know, it's the relationship between the United States and Afghanistan is a relationship between the United States and the Afghan people, which is encompasses many more people than the Taliban. But the reality, and the reason I think I had that slip, is that the United States has no choice but to work with the Taliban. That is the de facto government of Afghanistan. And we could talk about recognition if we want, but in some sense, at some point, it becomes a matter of semantics.
But that was established when you entered into peace agreement or Doha agreements. It was established that you were dealing with the Taliban. But now, what is your official policy? What is the U.S. official policy on Afghanistan? Do you think Afghanistan is, yeah?
Well, I think the official policy is that the United States is working with the Taliban to mitigate the threat of ISKP, is hoping that it can encourage the Taliban, at a minimum, not to enable Al-Qaeda, and is trying to. The United States is still the biggest provider of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. So I think the United States has a genuine. Again, I don't speak for the U.S. government, but this is my understanding. I think the United States has a genuine interest in preventing a complete humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and in that way, I think the United States has proved to be a responsible actor. The United States took a hit to its prestige when it had to withdraw from Afghanistan, and there was all kinds of chaos during the withdrawal. I actually don't think the United States necessarily has to be investing as much as it is in Afghanistan from a humanitarian perspective in order to maintain some sort of prestige or reputation. I think it's doing that because it genuinely cares about the Afghan people.
But are you not actually retaining about $9 billion which you owe to the Afghans?
Well, that gets into the legal system. So, look, $3.5 billion of that is subject to litigation in the United States, and unfortunately,
what sort of litigation?
The 9/11 families.
The Afghan people had nothing to do with that, with 9/11. So why are you punishing Afghan people?
You're preaching to the choir, but that was truly out of the Biden administration's hands. So unfortunately, if you give me 30 seconds on just this note, because it's a bit technical, unfortunately in the United States, we've treated terrorism almost like a tort. You know, the same way if I came up to you and hit you with a baseball bat, or I crashed into you with my car, you could sue me in court. We've treated terrorism the same way, and in my view, that's a mistake. In my view, the U.S. legal system and the courts are not capable of perhaps dealing with the nuances of terrorism and who is responsible for what, but we are a country of laws and we have our legal system, and the reality is the Biden administration's hands are completely tied because that $3.5 billion is subject to litigation for the 9/11 families. I agree with you. The Afghan people had nothing to do with 9/11, at a moral level and at a common sense level, it's absolutely preposterous that money is subject to litigation. And I sympathize and empathize with the 9/11 families, but it's preposterous that money is being litigated by the 9/11 families. Over terrorism, but that is the reality. And if anything, the Biden administration took steps to protect the rest of the money from being subject to that litigation. So actually, the Biden administration and President Biden got a lot of criticism when they had that press release in which they basically said in so many words that they were splitting the money in half, but they weren't really splitting the money in half. Basically, they did a calculation and they said, okay, how much money could these families possibly have a legitimate claim to? And by legitimate, I mean legitimate within the US legal system. And they came up with the number 3.5 billion, and they said, fine, we'll leave the 3.5 billion for them to fight over, but we're going to protect the rest of this money for the Afghan people. Now, if the Biden administration had said, we're going to protect all of this money, you know, the plaintiffs in that litigation aren't entitled to any of it, in the US system, the Biden administration could be violating their constitutional rights. So they couldn't do that. So I think, to President Biden's credit, he did everything he could possibly do to protect that money for the Afghan people. Now, where I have some differences with the administration is that they've essentially put the other $3.5 billion in a trust fund, and I think the trust has conditions that have to be met so far as when it would return to the Afghan people. And there is something about that you know, perhaps rubs me the wrong way a little bit, in which we're deciding the future of Afghanistan. On the other hand, there's real anti-money laundering risk, there's real countering of terrorist finance risks that exist, and the Taliban they know what steps they have to take regarding their central bank to get that money, and unfortunately the Taliban have not taken those steps. So the ball is in the Taliban's court in terms of getting that $3.5 billion. I know I've gone on a little bit long with this answer. I just want to say, I know that when Americans talk about the US legal system, and I sit here and I say, well, we can't possibly free up the $3.5 billion because it's subject to litigation, and in our system, they have a constitutional right to pursue their day in court. We talk about our legal system like it's the laws of physics or something. I know how ridiculous that sounds to the rest of the world. And I know that we Americans have a tendency to talk about our legal system as if it should be accepted
throughout the world.
Yeah, throughout the world. I know that. I know that.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is the political realities and the legal restrictions that the Biden administration faces is that it simply couldn't free up that $3.5 million.
Okay.
It does have more control over the other half, though.
Thank you, Adam, for such a explanation regarding the
Detailed
financial
answer.
sector. Yeah, I'll be asking regarding, which is relevant to Pakistan basically, as we say, TTP is a threat to Pakistan. It has centuries in Afghanistan. It has support of Afghan Taliban. It is equipped with military hardware left by US troops. US condemnation of TTP attacks in Pakistan is muted. Do you visualize any cooperation between Pakistan and US to counter TTP threats, which could also affect the region?
Well, of course, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes because none of us have clearances that would make us privy to that.
Yeah.
But I imagine that I can only imagine there must be some intelligence sharing going on behind the scenes. But in terms of a sort of robust help, the way we used to see in the past, where it was US drone strikes that were taking out TTP chiefs, and the TTP were terrified of US drones. And by the way, I think that's why today they're so explicit that they don't have any transnational ambitions, because I think the TTP are very concerned that if their rhetoric sounds transnational, or if they target Western targets, that those drones will return. But I don't see that era coming back in the short term. I think the calculation in Washington right now is that, look, the TTP is a problem. It's a problem. We see it every day. I always point out to folks that the Pakistani security forces and the police force are sustaining casualties that resemble what the United States was enduring in Afghanistan at the height of the surge. We're talking about daily attacks. Places like Lucky Marwat, like Di Khan, like Tank, Waziristan, where daily attacks are occurring by the TTP. But I think the attitude in Washington is, well, that's a problem that's a problem that Pakistan is going to have to deal with Afghanistan through the Taliban and through its own operations against the TTP. but this is not a problem that really affects our national security. I think the question is, at what point does the TTP violence become so intense and so destabilizing that it does affect U.S. national security because it threatens to destabilize the Pakistani state? Or alternatively, at what point does the TTP begin to have transnational ambitions or partner with other transnational terrorist groups in a way that threatens U.S. national security? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, Adam, a number of dialogues at the regional level have been initiated by certain countries, China, Russia, neighboring countries, Pakistan as well. How do you see, how the US sees these regional arrangements for achieving peace in Afghanistan?
My perception, again, I'm not an insider, I'm not in government, but my perception is that I think the US government is supportive of regional dialogues involving the Afghan Taliban. Yeah. And of course, the Russian-led dialogue has been effective in some ways, except that due to the war in Ukraine, it's become more complicated for both Russia and the United States to perhaps cooperate on the Afghanistan issue. And of course, unfortunately, two of the regional countries that are most important to the future of Afghanistan, Iran and Russia, the United States doesn't have a good relationship with. And in the case of one of those countries, the United States has no relationship. And so this is a problem. But I do think the United States probably wants to see regionally led dialogue. The U.S. simply cannot be the leader in dialogue when it comes to Afghanistan for a couple of reasons. One, we were a party to the conflict, and two, we're not here to stay in the region. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the war was a failure, in my view. So I don't think the United States is nearly as important to regional stability in Afghanistan as Afghanistan itself is and its neighbors.
My question is, again, relating to Afghanistan as well as Pakistan. Pakistan has been regarded as a frontline state by the US administration. And we sacrificed more than 80,000 lives. But why Pakistan's sacrifices are dismissed in Washington as self-inflicted? Why?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. I think there's folks in government who do understand the complexity of the situation. I think some of the louder voices you might hear in think tanks and in journalism have a much more black and white perspective. Look, we're sitting in a city that sacrificed, Islamabad. I mean, the Marriott explosion shook the city like an earthquake. Yeah. We're sitting in a city where plenty of folks suffered. I just came from Peshawar earlier today. I mean, that's a city that is still facing the aftershocks of this 20-year war in Afghanistan and will continue to face it. And so Pakistan is still paying the price. And of course, even if one is critical of some of the choices that the Pakistani military or the Pakistani state made, certainly the Pakistani people were not responsible for that, and yet they paid the largest price. I mean, next to Afghans, it was the two people who paid the largest price in this war were the Afghan people and the Pakistani people. I think there is a feeling among some stakeholders in Washington that, of course, Pakistan was playing both sides. They were supporting the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network was incredibly deadly for U.S. troops, and because the Pakistani state never bought into the U.S. war strategy completely, and because the Pakistani state made certain decisions that allowed extremists within its own borders to get a foothold, they should, I don't want to use the word deserve, but it's a natural consequence of Pakistan's own choices that it now has a TTP problem. I think there's people who think that. My position would be, we asked Pakistan to take one hell of a gamble by supporting our war effort in a full-fledged way. And we didn't really give them a choice either. And the truth is that we talk about democracy, but if Pakistan had been a true democracy on 9/11, there would have been parliamentary debates and there would have been a process, and we could not have simply gone to a democratic Pakistan and said, you're either with us or against us. There would have had to be a process. And it was only because Pakistan was not a true democracy at the time that we could exert that kind of coercive pressure and essentially force Pakistan to accompany us in a strategy that it didn't really believe in. And of course, the cost of doing that was that Pakistan disingenuously came along for the ride. And I don't mean disingenuously in a pejorative way, because we didn't really give Pakistan much of a choice. But Pakistan was not bought into the strategy. Now, we can explore the counterfactual of what would have happened if Pakistan had completely supported the government in Kabul and completely disavowed the Taliban and taken that, what I called one hell of a gamble, and assumed that the Republic would be able to sustain itself and provide security within its own borders and have a monopoly on violence and essentially be a functioning state, and assume that the United States would stay on until the job is done. What if? Maybe in that hypothetical scenario, the Afghan state would have developed more rapidly, the Taliban would have been extinguished, and Pakistan would have a peaceful neighbor, and there'd be freedom and rights for Afghans. It's possible. Nobody sitting in this room can say that they know that that's not possible. That's why it's a counterfactual. But of course, this is the issue. That was an incredible gamble for Pakistan to take. And I think Pakistan did understand that, okay, the Afghan Taliban are not a completely foreign force to Afghan society. There are segments of Afghan society that are sympathetic to the ideology of the Taliban. I think the Pakistani state probably understood there were serious problems with the political order that had been designed at the Bonn conference. And essentially, we talk about the Taliban being imposed in Afghanistan, but that political order was also imposed in Afghanistan. I think the Pakistani state saw the kind of infighting that existed among the political elites in the republic. And I think ultimately Pakistan made the calculation that the United States would leave. And they weren't wrong. I would say that Pakistan also made some incorrect calculations about the Afghan Taliban, and now Pakistan's paying the price for that. And the Afghan Taliban have proved more ideological than perhaps the Pakistani state thought.
Yeah, you're right, Adam. We may have made some wrong calculations, mistakes, and we are definitely paying for that. Final few words. Your views, or how does the Biden administration views Pakistan's policy of repatriating the illegal Afghan immigrants, or illegal immigrants, mostly Afghan?
Well, if you look at the way administration officials have reacted, it's been what I'd call muted. There's been very little criticism of it. And I think that's because the U.S. has other priorities with Pakistan, both as a CT partner, and I think the United States is grateful that Pakistan has hosted the Afghans who are meant to be repatriated to the United States, and it doesn't want to alienate Pakistan by being too critical of the overall policy when the main priority is to make sure that those Afghans who are in the process of coming to the U.S. are not caught up in this policy. I think that's what's most important to Washington. I think the overall mood in Washington, outside of government, if we talk about civil society and think tanks, is probably critical. I think especially the way this policy has been executed, and what I'd say to the Pakistani state is, look, the way it's been executed has not been good for Pakistan from an optics point of view, and I think its execution has been a bit sloppy, if I may say so. But and there are reasons for and against the deportation. My individual view is that Pakistan is perhaps undoing some goodwill that it had with the Afghan people, but at the same time, there's that saying, don't throw rocks from a glass castle, or don't throw stones from a glass castle. As an American, I'm sitting in a glass castle. I mean, we can't even, or a glass house, we can't even process the SIV, the Special Immigrant Visa applicants, who were the interpreters who worked directly with US troops. We are unable to process many of them. We were unable to evacuate them. So I feel ill-equipped to preach to Pakistan right now when the administrative state in the United States has made so many ridiculous excuses for why it can't process those Afghans who served alongside us faster. So I feel ill-equipped to preach to Pakistan about this policy, beyond the fact that I think the way it's being executed and perhaps the extent of it is undoing some goodwill that the Pakistani people have built with the Afghan people, and that Pakistan should consider what the cost of undoing that goodwill is.
Adam, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this was our second program with Adam Weinstein. We hope to have him again on other issues. During this program, we try to discuss various aspects of US policy on Afghanistan. Thank you for watching and hope to see you soon. Bye.